The first thing I remember is the shine of my headlamp on blackened rock, a tight cone of white light breathing in the dark while the rest of the cave stayed stubbornly still. The air down there tasted like old smoke and metal dry enough that every breath felt like it scraped the back of my throat. On the floor, scattered over the stone like someone had spilled a box of brittle twigs, were tiny burned stems, their tips curled and gray. The walls above them were stained a dull brown soot, climbing just about as high as a man could reach if he stood and lifted his hand into the dark. There was a hush. You don't get on the surface. No wind, no insects, just the soft tick of grit falling from the ceiling every now and then. When I tilted my light up, I saw grooves cut into the rock at chest level, uneven trembling lines pressed deeper in some places, fading out in others. For a long moment, I just stood there with the beam fixed on those marks, listening to my own breath echo in that narrow shaft, feeling the weight of something I didn't yet have words for. The stone was cool under my glove when I reached out and touched it, as if it had held onto the memory of the last hands that leaned there. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from and follow if you believe some names should never fade. I've spent more of my life in that desert than anywhere else. Most mornings back then started the same way, the low hum of the swamp cooler in the Ranger, housing the smell of weak coffee and dust, and the sky just starting to pale through the narrow kitchen window. By 6 o'clock, the light would be sliding over the red rock outside, turning the mesas a soft pink, while the ravens complained from the radio tower like they were already tired of the heat. I'd lace up my boots at the small wooden table, feel the grit on the floor under my socks, and listen to the old park radio crackle to life with weather reports and road conditions. It's a quiet kind of job most days, the kind of quiet where you hear tires on gravel from half a mile away, and you know just from the sound whether it's a camper van or a ranch truck rolling in. The station I was assigned to sat at the end of a long washboard road, 2 hours from the nearest grocery store, and all the way out in that country of sun and stone. We had a small visitor room that always smelled like paper maps, sunblock, and sweat drying on nylon. The air inside stayed 10 degrees cooler than outside, but the heat found its way in anyway, riding on every person who opened the door and stomped their boots on the mat. On the walls were faded posters about flash floods and heat exhaustion, a bulletin board with handwritten route notes left by hikers, and a laminated map so creased from fingers tracing paths that some corners had turned white. By late June, the cicadas would be screaming in the few cottonwoods around the compound, their noise blending with the low rumble of generators and the slap of screen doors every time someone stepped in or out. That summer of 2018, the desert came on hard and fast. Spring had barely loosened its grip before the thermometer at the station started flirting with triple digits by lunchtime. You could feel it in the way the truck seats burned the backs of your legs and the way the air smelled by noon like hot stone and engine oil and something metallic rising from the old fuel tanks. The tourists thinned out on the longer routes when the temperatures climbed. Most folks were content to snap a few pictures from overlooks and retreat back to air conditioning and ice. The ones who still came to ask about the maze, about dropping down those backcountry routes for days at a time, tended to look a little different, leaner, quieter, a certain steadiness around the eyes. I'd gotten good over the years at reading people who walked up to my counter. You learn to notice the scuffed boots versus the brand new ones, how quickly a person unfolds the map, how many questions they ask about water and shade. Sometimes you spot the shakiness in someone's hands, or the way they keep glancing back at the door as if part of them isn't fully committed to the idea of being out here at all. Other times, they have that calm that almost worries me, more like they underestimate just how big and indifferent all that rock really is. I'd jot details in our log route vehicle expected return and tuck away impressions in the back of my mind, capable, overconfident, anxious alone. I didn't know Ethan Ward yet that June, but I knew his kind of story. Young, strong, something gone sideways in school or work that sent them looking for a place where the only thing that mattered was how far their legs could carry them in a day. We'd hear bits and pieces at the counter when they checked in the way folks do when they're talking just to fill the silence while you stamp a permit. Some would mention a breakup or a job they quit. Others said less and stared a little too long at the map like they were hoping the lines and names on the paper could answer questions they hadn't said out loud. The light in that little room always fell in the same way in the afternoons, a bright slash across the counter that made people squint and pull off their caps, revealing tired eyes and sunburned noses. Albuquerque wasn't a place I knew well, but I'd seen it enough on license plates to picture the drive up interstate truck stops, that long, empty stretch before the land opens into red and gold. Ethan grew up there in a one-story house on a quiet street where the loudest thing on a summer evening was the buzz of yard trimmers and the slosh of sprinklers crossing cracked sidewalks. His dad, Michael, ran a small auto shop off a frontage road, the kind of place that always smelled like rubber and old coffee. His mom, Diane, spent her days at an elementary school copying worksheets, tying loose shoelaces, and listening to kids stumble through reading. They weren't the sort of people who chased drama or moved around much. Their lives ran on a steady rhythm of morning commutes, school calendars, and Sunday dinners with the TV humming softly in the background. Ethan had been the big hope in that house for a little while. Scholarship athlete photos pinned up on the fridge of him in pads and cleats, grinning under stadium lights. You can almost hear the echoes if you've ever lived near a high school field announcer's voice crackling through old speakers marching band a half-step off parents yelling themselves hoarse against the cool night air. Then one bad fight at practice. One stupid moment raised voices, shoved helmets, hands where they shouldn't be. And suddenly, he was suspended. The calls stopped coming in from coaches. The campus felt colder and smaller. The routine that had given his day's shape disappeared almost overnight. Back home, that change has a sound to it too. The creak of his bedroom door staying shut later in the morning, the quiet chime of the microwave at odd hours, late-night footsteps in the hallway when everyone else is sleeping. His friends said he pulled back after that, spent more time alone in his room with the blinds half drawn, letting the blue light from his phone wash the walls. He'd go for shorter runs around the neighborhood after sunset, shoes slapping softly on the pavement, the air cooling just enough that you could smell damp grass and exhaust as cars rolled by. When people asked what came next, he had a way of shrugging that didn't sound like the old him, the boy who used to talk about plays and seasons and majors and future cities. He started answering with things like, "I just need to think," or "I've got to figure it out," and then drifting off mid-sentence as if the rest of the thought didn't quite hold together yet. In a house that small, that kind of silence has weight. It settles into the corners, into the clink of dishes and the squeak of the back screen door. The idea of going to Utah wasn't an impulsive road trip, dare not the way his parents later told it. He'd been hunched over his laptop at the kitchen table for weeks, the glow reflecting off his face while the ceiling fan clicked slowly overhead. Topographic maps, park websites, trip reports written by strangers who talked about the maze like it was some kind of riddle carved into stone. He printed things out the old-fashioned way, smoothing the paper with the flat of his palm, tracing possible routes with one blunt finger, while the ice maker rattled in the freezer behind him. Michael would glance over his shoulder, sometimes smelling toner and coffee, seeing those narrow contour lines stacked like fingerprints on the page, and not quite knowing what to say. There were small conversations, half-started, half-abandoned. A comment from Diane about the heat about folks going missing out there, sometimes drifting across the kitchen while she wiped down the counter with a lemon-scented cloth. A cautious reminder from Michael to leave a plan with the park rangers to take more water than he thought he'd need to text when he got off the trail each night if he had service. Ethan would nod, look past them toward the window where the late afternoon sun turned the neighbor's stucco wall a soft orange, and say he'd be careful. He mentioned wanting to clear his head, and there was a roughness underneath the words that made Diane put a hand on his shoulder for a second longer than usual, feeling the tension in his muscles before he pulled away gently. The morning he left Albuquerque, the house woke earlier than usual. Coffee brewed before dawn, filling the kitchen with that familiar dark smell, while the news murmured low from the corner of the living room. Suitcases weren't involved, just a hiking pack that looked too big for the doorway, its straps worn smooth from years of use, and a pair of boots set neatly by the back door. Outside, the street was still only the faint hiss of sprinklers and the soft clack of a neighbor's garbage lid echoing in the thin blue light. They loaded the pack and a cooler into his older SUV, the metal still cool to the touch, dew beating on the windshield, before the sun had a chance to burn it off. Goodbyes in families like theirs aren't long speeches. His mom straightened the collar of his faded t-shirt fingers, brushing against the rough fabric, and told him to call when he got to the park. His dad clapped a hand on his shoulder, squeezing once the smell of motor oil and aftershave lingering as he stepped back. Someone made a joke about bringing back too many pictures of rocks, and there was a brief flash of the old grin from Ethan, wide and unguarded, before it faded into a smaller, more private smile. When he finally pulled away from the curb, the sound of the engine rolling down the block, mixed with the first real bird song of the morning, leaving the house feeling bigger and emptier than it had the night before. By the time he reached our little corner of Utah, the day had climbed into that flat white heat that makes the air above the road shimmer. At the last gas station before the park boundary, the pumps ticked slowly while the smell of gasoline and dust blew across the lot. Inside, the cooler doors thumped shut behind him as he grabbed water and energy bars, the hum of old fluorescent lights filling the narrow aisles. He unfolded a fresh paper map on the counter, its corners curling back toward the cashier while he asked a few careful questions about the drive ahead, his voice low and polite. Before heading back out, he picked up a few extra boxes of matches, sliding them into his hand with a small, almost apologetic shrug, as if he didn't quite know why he felt better having them. When he finally walked through the door of our station, the light hit him from behind, turning him into a silhouette for a heartbeat before my eyes adjusted. The room smelled like it always did, sunscreen sweat, and the faint sweetness of cheap air freshener, fighting a losing battle with desert dust. He dropped his pack beside his boots with a soft thud, pushed back his cap, and stood there for a moment, just letting the cool air touch his face. Up close, he had that look I've seen on a lot of young men out here. Strong body, tired eyes, and something unsettled working just beneath the surface. He spoke clearly, laid out his route with a kind of quiet precision that told me he'd done his homework, but there were pauses between his sentences that didn't quite fit his age. I filled out the form, listening to the scratch of my pen on the clipboard while he spelled his last name slowly, carefully. He listed his starting point, the steep descent, the days he figured he'd spend in the maze, and the plan to come back up the same way. His fingers tapped lightly on the counter as he talked little drum beats against the laminated surface, stopping only when I asked about emergency contacts, and he gave me his parents' phone number. When we were done, I slid his copy of the permit across the counter, the paper warm from my hand, and watched him tuck it neatly into a pocket on his pack. There was a moment, just a small one, when he looked past me out the window at the hazy horizon, and his expression went so still that for a second the whole room felt quieter. Later that evening, after the last of the day, visitors rattled back toward pavement and motels. The station settled into its usual night sounds. The radio murmured with distant voices. The refrigerator in the back kicked on with a low rattle, and outside the wind moved grit across the concrete like sandpaper. I stood on the porch for a while, feeling the heat still radiating off the steps through the soles of my boots, watching the sky go from orange to purple to a deep, steady blue. In the darkness beyond the sodium light, the dirt lot held a few shapes of parked vehicles, hulks of metal cooling as the desert finally exhaled. One set of headlights should have appeared on that road before I went to bed, cutting a pale path through the dust toward our little island of light. They didn't, and the night closed in as usual, but the silence felt a shade heavier than it had the day before. I remember the morning the shift began because nothing felt unusual at first. The air outside the station was already warm, the kind of heat that builds slowly and deliberately, pushing a faint metallic smell into the wind, before the sun even crests the mesas. I'd slept lightly, the desert's thin dawn light slipping past the blinds and onto the floorboards. When I stepped out onto the porch with my mug, the horizon was washed in pale rose, and the only sound was the scrape of a lizard moving under the propane tank. It was an ordinary summer morning, in every sense quiet, predictable, steady. Then the radio crackled in a tone I didn't recognize, not frantic, not calm, just off. A clipped voice from dispatch asked if we'd had any word from a young man who filed a route plan a few days back. That was the first small shift in the air, barely enough to name, but enough to make my fingers tighten around the mug. I walked inside, listening to the hum of the swamp cooler and the soft tick of the wall clock, and pulled the logbook down from the shelf. My handwriting stared back at me. Ethan Ward, 22. Albuquerque Maze route expected out by now. I paused with my finger on his name, hearing the faint echo of his voice from days earlier. Those careful pauses he took before answering simple questions. Nothing dramatic, nothing strange, just enough to remember. When dispatch mentioned his parents had been trying his phone with no luck, I felt a thin thread of concern pull taut inside me. Folks lose service out here all the time, and most check in late rather than early. But something in the tone of that call, heavy, hesitant, told me this wasn't the usual he'll show up by noon situation. I tried calling his number myself, listening as the ring stretched out into the static hiss that passes for silence in this part of the desert. No answer. I stepped outside again, letting the heat settle over my shoulders, and scanned the dirt lot as though his SUV might miraculously appear between the junipers. The air carried that dusty sweetness you get right before the wind kicks up, and in that stillness I felt a prickle along the back of my neck. You learn to trust that feeling out here, even if you can't justify it yet. Within the hour, I drove out toward the Golden Staircase trailhead. The tires hummed over Washboard Road, vibrating through the steering wheel, and the sky turned a harsher blue as the day climbed. When I reached the lot, the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No fresh tire marks. No hikers milling around. Just the harsh buzz of a single cicada caught in the shade of a boulder. And there, off to the left, in a sliver of thin shadow, sat Ethan's SUV. Windows dusty, sun glaring off the hood. A shape too familiar, too still. I parked beside it and stepped out, the heat rising from the ground through my boots. I opened his driver's door gently, the hinge giving a faint groan. Inside, everything was in place. Map on the seat sketch pad in the back, a bottle of water half full but untouched since he left it there. No sign of a rush, no torn gear, no footprint in the dust suggesting someone else had opened the door. Just that quiet emptiness that always sets my teeth on edge. I told myself it was possible he'd simply come out somewhere else. Maybe got turned around and walked to another access road. It happens. It's embarrassing for hikers, but it happens. But the desert has a way of stripping empty reassurances down to their bones. I walked to the trailhead, shading my eyes with my palm staring down at the start of the descent. The dust at the edge held faint impressions from days before, but nothing fresh. No prints leading out, no sign of movement, just the wind shifting grains of sand along the stone like a slow breath. I radioed in that his vehicle was still here, and the dispatcher's voice tightened just enough for me to hear it. She said his parents had called again this time, sounding more frightened than worried. They hadn't heard from him since the night before he started the route. The image of that small Albuquerque kitchen rose in my mind. His mother's hand on his shoulder, his father's nod of encouragement, the quiet pride behind their concern as he loaded that pack into the SUV. I imagined them now staring at a silent phone, a clock ticking too loud in the background. I started down the first switchback, the rock already radiating heat. Every few steps I'd stop and crouch, looking for anything, scuffed stone, broken brush, even a dropped cap or wrapper. But there was nothing except the faint hiss of wind moving through the canyon like water through a narrow stream. The silence pressed against my ears. When you're out there long enough, you learn how to listen for what should be present but isn't birdsong, distant footfalls, the scrape of trekking poles. That morning, all of it was missing. By midday, the air felt like it came straight off a stove burner. My shirt clung to my back and sweat collected under the brim of my hat. I walked the first stretch of Ethan's planned route, calling his name every so often, my voice bouncing weakly off the canyon walls. Nothing answered back but the low, hollow echo of my own words. I checked my watch, took a long drink from my flask, and tried calling dispatch again. My hand slightly trembling, though I told myself it was just the heat. They patched me through to Ethan's father. The sound of him clearing his throat before speaking told me everything. He tried to keep his voice steady as he asked whether I'd found anything at all. I could hear a TV murmuring behind him, maybe turned low on a news channel, and a dog collar jingling in the background. Regular life, sounds the kind that usually mean comfort. But none of it softened the worry in his voice. When I told him the SUV was here but no sign of Ethan yet, the silence that followed was longer than it should have been. Deep. Heavy. A silence carried by a man gripping the edge of his kitchen counter knuckles white, staring at a phone he wished he could pull his son through. Back on the trail, I walked farther than protocol really allowed on a first check, telling myself I was just being thorough. But underneath that fear had already planted itself, spreading out in slow, cold roots. The maze is a place that can swallow a man without effort. One wrong turn, one slip on loose rock, one moment of misjudging light and shadow, and you're suddenly in a world where every direction looks the same, where heat drains you faster than you realize. But Ethan was prepared. He had water. He had experience. He had a clear plan and a steady head. That's what I kept telling myself as the afternoon light sharpened, turning every ridgeline into a blade of white fire. By late day, I headed back up the trail, my legs aching, my throat raw. When I reached the parking lot again, the light had softened into that dusty gold you only get in desert summers. Ethan's SUV sat unmoved, dust settling deeper into the windshield, the metal popping softly as it adjusted to the evening cool. I stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the hood, feeling the fading warmth of the day. I drove back toward the station, the desert stretching out around me in endless red and ochre waves. Somewhere along the road, a gust of wind kicked sand across the windshield, making a sound like soft rain, even though the sky was dry. I slowed the truck and watched the dust swirl in the headlights before settling back onto the road. Small things like that always make me think of all the steps a missing person might have taken, all the signs the earth erases long before we ever reach them. When I stepped back inside the station, the light was dimming and the air smelled faintly of sun-baked wood and old magazines. I hung my hat on the hook and stared at the logbook again, tracing the line I'd written under Ethan's name. Expected return. Yesterday. It felt heavier than ink should feel. Moments later, Ben Porter walked in from the back room, rubbing his hands on a towel, the smell of machine oil clinging faintly to him. He asked what the radio chatter was about earlier. I told him everything in a quiet voice, the words sitting uneasily in my mouth. He nodded slowly, eyes narrowing in that thoughtful way of his, and leaned against the counter with his arms folded. He didn't say anything right away, and that silence, more than anything, made the knot in my chest tighten. We made a call to the sheriff's office to report the situation formally. No alarms yet, no sirens. Just a preliminary notice, a missing hiker whose car was still where he'd left it. Protocol said we'd wait until morning before escalating. But the sun had dipped lower, and the sky outside had turned the color of cooling embers. I stepped back out onto the porch for a moment, listening to the hum of a single porch light struggling against the dusk. The wind had picked up, carrying that dry rattle through the brush, and the world felt too still in between the gusts. I watched the empty stretch of road leading to the station, half expecting to see a dust trail rising from a returning vehicle headlights, cresting the last bend. But the road stayed empty, the horizon quiet. And then, just as the last light folded behind the mesas, I heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel. A sheriff's cruiser rolled into view, its silhouette easing to a stop beside the porch. The deputy stepped out, shut the door softly, and before he even reached the steps, he took off his hat and held it against his chest. That was when the dread settled in, fully deep and immovable, a weight that told me the calm of the desert had shifted into something else entirely. The sheriff's cruiser sat in the lot with its engine ticking down the hot metal, giving off that faint burnt dust smell you only notice when the desert is trying to cool after a long day. The deputy who'd stepped out, hat in hand, jaw tight, asked me to walk him through every detail from the moment Ethan signed his route sheet. His voice was low, steady, respectful in that way law enforcement gets when they're trying not to alarm anyone too early. But even before he finished his questions, I could feel the shift settling over the station, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees the moment uniforms got involved. This was no longer a late hiker or a missed check-in. It had nudged its way into something larger, something that made the air feel heavier, as if the land itself was bracing for what came next. By the time the sun was gone, red and blue lights were flickering across the dirt outside, bouncing off the corners of the ranger trucks and stretching long shadows across the ground. A briefing unfolded on the porch beneath the buzzing sodium lamp. Voices stayed calm, clipped, but I could hear the undercurrent. People calculating daylight left distance covered the odds of someone walking out on their own after so many hours unseen. Maps were spread across the hood of a cruiser, the paper rippling slightly whenever a breeze passed through. A dog team was called from Moab. A helicopter was requested for first light. The deputy scribbled notes on a pad, the graphite whispering across the page. It all had the rhythm of routine, but everyone standing there knew the truth. Routine is what you cling to when you're hoping it isn't already too late. Just after dawn, the chopper arrived, its blades thumping against the morning air in deep, rhythmic waves that rattled the station windows. The scent of aviation fuel cut through the usual desert smells of dust and sagebrush. Search crews gathered near the trucks, tightening straps, checking radios, pulling bandanas over their necks to prepare for the day's heat. Ben stood beside me, arms crossed, staring out at the horizon where the light was finally spilling across the canyons. He didn't say much, he rarely did, but the way he kept adjusting the brim of his hat told me he felt the same hollow tug I did. We moved out with the first team just as the sun cleared the ridgelines. The world down at the golden staircase was brighter than it looked from the top light, bouncing off pale sandstone shadows stretched into narrow pools of cool air. We fanned out along the descent, calling Ethan's name in measured intervals. Our voices traveled unevenly, swallowed by walls of rock that turned sound into something faint and distorted. The dogs worked back and forth across the trail, noses low, their handlers murmuring reassurances in soft tones that drifted through the stillness. Farther down, the canyon opened into that unforgiving country where the maze begins, stone corridors, dead-end passages, benches of rock that all look the same when the light hits them wrong. A drone buzzed overhead, moving in slow arcs, its small frame shimmering silver in the heat. Crews checked dry creek beds, crouched near overhangs, peered into narrow slots barely wide enough for a person to slip through. Each ravine we cleared brought the same result, nothing. No dropped gear, no torn fabric, no footprints holding shape long enough to trust. Only the scuff of our own boots and the soft static of radios. By midday, the temperature had climbed so sharply that even the flies seemed to retreat into shade. The air carried that oven-dry smell, hot rock, and sun-cooked minerals, making each breath feel a little thinner. We kept moving, but you could feel the weight settling across the group. Rangers aren't strangers to lost hikers, but there's a tone people get when the hours stretch without any sign. It's a quiet tone, like everyone's trying not to acknowledge the thought they've already had. A deputy found what looked like a partial footprint near a dry wash, and for a moment the energy around us shifted. He knelt beside it, brushing dust away with careful fingers. But the edges were soft, too soft, and when Ben stepped over to look, he shook his head slowly. Coyote. You learn the difference after enough years out here, the spacing, the angles, the way weight presses into the sand. It wasn't Ethan. And just like that, the little swell of hope dissolved back into the heat. Later in the afternoon, one of the volunteers radioed about a scrap of fabric caught on a juniper branch. We hiked to him, the wind tugging at the sweat-damp shirts on our backs. The scrap turned out to be part of an old bandana, sun-bleached, almost white. Probably there for years. We pocketed it just in case, but deep down everyone knew it wasn't what we needed. The volunteer, a quiet man with a steady gait, looked down at his boots for a long moment afterward, his shoulders sinking as if he'd let someone down just by finding the wrong thing. The dog teams pushed on noses, testing the shifting currents of warm air. For a brief moment, one of the dogs lifted its head tail, stiffening, and the handler called for quiet. We all stopped every footfall, every word, even the drone above held still, as if the land itself was listening. The dog pulled forward a few yards, then paused, whining softly before circling back. Whatever trace it thought it caught was gone, blown away, or never there. The handler gave a low sigh, rubbing the dog's flank. The disappointment rippled quietly through all of us. By early evening, we gathered around the trucks again, faces streaked with dust shirts, stiff with dried sweat. The chopper returned, skimming low across the ridges, sending a wave of hot air rolling across the clearing as it settled onto the pad. The pilot shook his head before anyone asked. From the air, the land was an endless maze of heat and shadow, too many places for a man to disappear, too few clues to push the search in any one direction. He'd seen nothing at all. Back at the station, the maps were spread out again, corners held down by thermoses and radios. The sun had dropped enough that long beams of amber light slid through the windows, turning the dust in the air into drifting gold. We traced routes with blunt pencils, arguing gently over possible detours Ethan might have taken. Maybe he'd gone farther down a side canyon to find shade. Maybe he'd mistaken one bend for another. Maybe he'd tried to climb out someplace difficult. Every suggestion came with a counter-argument. Every theory felt thin, stretched too far to lean on. The rumors started trickling in by the next morning. They always do. A couple staying in Moab said they heard hikers mention a man who looked tired on the trail. Someone else thought they'd seen a figure on a distant ridge. A shop owner recalled selling water to a boy who matched Ethan's description. All of it vague, all delivered with that air of uncertainty, as if folks weren't sure whether they truly saw something real or were trying to convince themselves they had. I wrote every detail down anyway, because out here, even the faintest thread can matter. One of the deputies pulled me aside that afternoon. His voice dropped low as he pointed to a section of the map, tracing a line that snaked away from Ethan's intended route. If he wandered here, he said, tapping a narrow slot canyon, he could have gotten turned around. His tone was steady, but his eyes told a different story. This wasn't a simple detour. It was one of those places where GPS signals vanish, shadows stretch in ways that confuse even seasoned hikers, and temperatures can swing 30 degrees in an hour. I stared at the map for a long moment, feeling the beginnings of a chill beneath my shirt despite the heat. We headed out again and again each day, crawling over new sections of the labyrinth. The canyon walls rose high and close in some places, creating pockets of cool air that smelled faintly of damp stone. In others, the sun beat down so mercilessly that even the lizards stayed hidden under ledges. Volunteers trudged through the maze with radios clipped to their packs, their voices breaking through the static every so often with updates that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Negative here. Clear on this side. Moving to the next grid. The sound of those transmissions began to echo in my mind, even at night, repeating in that hollow matter-of-fact tone that seems almost cruel after a while. On the fourth day, we found a faint indentation near the base of a sandstone bench, something that might have been a boot print, or might have been wishful thinking. The edges had already softened under the heat, and none of us could say for certain who or what made it. We photographed it, flagged it, marked coordinates, and moved on. A part of me hated moving on, like leaving that spot behind was betraying something. But the desert doesn't give you time to sit with your doubts. You keep walking. The emotional strain began to show in subtle ways. A volunteer snapped at a deputy over a misplaced marker. One of the dog handlers sat alone in the shade, rubbing her temples, her posture sagging under exhaustion. Ben, who'd always been the calmest of us, grew quieter, jaw working slightly whenever someone mentioned what might have happened. At night, after the teams dispersed, I'd stand outside the station, listening to the faint ring of insects and the hum of the lone porch light. The desert at night has its own pulse, usually steady, comforting. But during those days, something about the quiet felt wrong, like a song missing its anchor note. Word traveled through nearby towns, and before long, locals were stopping by the station with food, spare batteries, even handwritten notes offering help. Some brought old stories, tales of hikers who'd gone off-route decades ago, of strange lights seen across distant mesas, of narrow slots you could fall into and never climb out of. Most of them were harmless stories told with a shrug, but you could hear the worry threaded between the syllables. People know that once the land holds someone, it doesn't always give them back. Theories spread among the search teams, too, though folks tried to keep them quiet. Maybe Ethan ran out of water and sought shade too deep in the canyons. Maybe he injured his leg and couldn't move. Maybe he found a shortcut that didn't pan out. Each explanation tried to wrap the situation in something neat and manageable. But nothing about the maze is neat, and nothing felt manageable anymore. Fatigue settled into my bones by the 6th day. I could feel it when I crouched, when I climbed, when I lifted myself into the truck seat at night with a small groan I tried to hide. My hands were raw from gripping sandstone and rope. My throat stayed dry no matter how much water I drank. And still, every morning before sunrise, I laced up my boots and stepped out into the thin, cool air, listening to the quiet with a sense of obligation that ran deeper than protocol. It was as if I owed something to that young man, to the last conversation we shared, the last look he gave the horizon from my counter. Late one afternoon, after a long loop through a harsh stretch of broken plateau, I returned to the station to find several deputies gathered around the map. Their voices were low-clipped. One of them held a set of photos in his hand, edges curling slightly from the heat. I couldn't see what was printed on them from where I stood, but something in the way he held his jaw made the room feel colder. He looked up when I stepped closer, his thumb resting against the edge of the top photo. "Sam," he said quietly, "we've got something new." And though he didn't explain, though he didn't turn the image around or give any hint of what they'd found or thought they'd found, I felt that same prickle along the back of my neck. I'd felt the morning the first call came in. A shift in the air. A warning carried inside a silence that suddenly felt too deep. By late September, the heat had eased just enough that mornings felt almost cool again. A thin breath of desert air drifting across the ground before the sun climbed high enough to burn it off. We'd been at the search for weeks by then, each day ending with the same empty maps and the same hollow reports. Still, none of us had stopped looking. Not really. We just carried the weight more quietly. The shift happened on a day that began like all the others, briefing at sunrise dust, hanging in the beams of light, volunteers tightening their packs, while deputies sipped bitter coffee from metal mugs. I was standing near the back of the group when one of the deputies stepped out of the office, a radio pressed hard against his ear. His face went still in a way that set something cold loose in my chest. He held up a hand for silence, listening, jaw tightening as the voice on the other end spoke fast, too fast. Then he looked at us. Eyes sharp, posture stiff, and said they'd spotted something on the southern wall of the canyon, something the climbers thought we needed to see immediately. That was all he said. But the urgency in his voice, the sudden tightening of the air around us, made my heart drop before I even started walking. We moved out fast, trucks bouncing over the rutted road engines, growling as dust trailed behind us in long golden plumes. A helicopter met us overhead, its blades chopping through the still warm morning air, sending ripples across the scrub. When we reached the jump-off point, the climbers who radioed in were waiting 3 men from Salt Lake City ropes at their waists, dust streaked across their shirts. One of them pointed to a narrow opening halfway down the rock face, a shadowed slit tucked beneath an overhang. He said their light had caught something inside, something human. Those words drained the strength from my legs for a moment. We secured ropes and dropped toward the opening, the stone grazing my gloves, tiny grains of sand drifting off the ledges like a slow waterfall. The closer we got, the colder the air felt, an unnatural pocket of coolness in an otherwise sun-baked world. When my boots touched the lip of the opening, I steadied myself, leaned in, and let my flashlight begin its slow sweep through the darkness. The beam found a narrow passage that curved downward walls, closing in tight enough that our shoulders brushed stone. Dust hung suspended in the still air, moving only when we moved. We followed that gradual descent until the ground suddenly gave way beneath us into a vertical shaft no wider than a couple of arm lengths. The darkness below looked thick as though it had weight. A deputy lowered the first rope and we began the slow, careful descent into that well of shadow. The smell hit me halfway down dry stone, mixed with something faintly scorched like burned wood long after the fire's gone cold. When my boots finally touched bottom, the beam of my light landed on a floor covered in tiny blackened stems. Matches. Hundreds of them. Some broken, some burned clean through, all lying scattered like brittle bones. My throat tightened. I could feel my heartbeat in my jaw. The walls around us were stained a smoky brown, the soot rising just about as high as a man standing with his arm lifted. I swept my light across the shaft, and that's when I saw him. A figure slumped in a seated position against the far wall. Boots still on clothing faded into muted earth tones, head bowed slightly as if he'd simply fallen asleep in the darkness. His pack lay nearby, zipped shut, nothing torn or tossed. The bottle beside him was empty, its plastic warped by time and heat. I knew before anyone spoke. I knew in my bones. We moved closer with a reverence usually reserved for the very old or the newly fallen. A deputy crouched beside the remains, his breath-shallow flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. I felt a sting behind my eyes. I wasn't prepared for grief, mixing with the shock of the moment settling over me like a weight I couldn't shake. Ethan Ward had been missing for months, but seeing him there, surrounded by those matches, he must have struck one by one just to hold back the darkness, struck something deep inside me. While the room stayed painfully still, one of the forensic techs ran his gloved fingers along the wall above Ethan's shoulder. A texture caught his attention, scratches layered beneath the soot. The tech leaned closer gently, brushing away the dark film. The letters beneath it appeared slowly, as if rising out of the stone itself. Carved lines, uneven, shaky, but deliberate. Words etched by someone who must have been exhausted, dehydrated, and fighting to hold on long enough to leave the truth behind. I remember the silence when the message became clear. Even the radio chatter fell away like the canyon held its breath. It was Ethan's hand that left it there. There was no doubt. His last act. His final strength poured into carving the description of the person who'd put him here. A man around 40. Gray beard, red jacket. A tourist, he wrote. And the most chilling line, he threw me in. For a moment, everything in me went hollow. My breath thinned. My knees felt weak enough to give. I'd spent months hoping the desert had taken Ethan by accident, hoping foolishly maybe that nature had simply claimed him the way it sometimes does in these canyons. But the truth carved into that wall turned the air colder than any cave draft. This wasn't misfortune. It wasn't a lost hiker. It wasn't the desert's indifferent hand. Someone had done this. Someone had looked at that narrow opening in the stone and made a choice. The scene around us became a different kind of quiet, methodical focused. Photos snapped in bursts of white light, sound echoing strangely in the enclosed space. Measurements were taken. The rope above us trembled as more personnel descended. Radios crackled with clipped updates, voices lower than usual. A deputy asked me to step back, his tone gentle, his hand briefly touching my forearm before he moved past me. I didn't argue. I couldn't. My legs barely remembered how to hold me upright. We arranged for Ethan's remains to be carefully lifted from the shaft. When his body rose into the soft daylight, the canyon seemed to change colors, shifting subtly, shadows lengthening as if the place mourned with us. A few deputies removed their hats. One of the dog handlers lowered her hid fingers, brushing her eyes. Ben stood beside me, shoulders squared, jaw trembling ever so slightly. He whispered something under his breath, something I couldn't hear but felt all the same. Word spread fast. By the time we returned to the station, the sheriff and 2 investigators from the state were already there, papers in hand, faces set in the kind of grim determination I'd only seen a few times in my career. Ethan's parents were on the phone within the hour. The sheriff stepped into the back room to speak with them privately, but even through the door I heard the breaking in Michael Ward's voice. Diane cried softly, the sound carrying through the thin walls like a wound you couldn't bandage. Forensic teams swarmed the canyon over the next days, photographing, scanning, documenting every inch of that hidden cave. The carved message was confirmed as genuine almost immediately. The letters matched the stone flakes on the floor. The force of the strokes matched the tiny chips embedded in Ethan's fingernails. He'd carved those words himself in the final hours of his life after the matches ran low and the darkness began to swallow his light. It didn't take long to give the man he described a name. Investigators linked the gray-bearded tourist in a red jacket to a drifter named Lucas Easton, 43. No fixed address, a history of violence, and a pattern of drifting through national parks during the off-season. The moment his image hit the bulletin, the pieces began to align the sightings on earlier trails, the hushed reports from scattered campgrounds, and the way he always seemed to disappear just when a hiker did. The truth was worse than any of us were prepared to face. Ethan's message wasn't just a clue. It was the key to a trail of disappearances that stretched far beyond our canyon. As the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across the station floor, I sat at my desk with the door cracked open. The night wind pushed dust across the porch in soft waves, shaping and reshaping the patterns with every gust. Behind me, phones rang, radios chirped, papers rustled under hurried hands. The weight of what we now knew pressed hard against my chest. And then came the final call of the night, brief urgent from an investigator across the county line. They'd found something else. Not an answer. Not yet. But the next piece of a story we were only beginning to understand. In the hours after we brought Ethan's body out of that cold shaft, the station felt like a place holding its breath. The sun had dropped behind the mesas, leaving the yard washed in a pale blue-gray. The kind of twilight that flattens everything and makes distance hard to read. Deputies moved in and out of the office with quiet determination, their boots brushing grit across the floor. Every radio transmission sounded sharper, more clipped, as if the air itself had lost its softness. I sat at the edge of my desk with my hands folded too tightly, trying to let the truth settle in without collapsing under it. It didn't settle. It just hovered there, heavy as stone. The sheriff briefed us in low tones, his voice steady but edged with something close to disbelief. Within minutes of confirming Ethan's message, neighboring counties were notified. The state lab was alerted. The FBI sent word they were preparing a team to review any older cases that might connect. It was like watching wildfire spread across a dry field, fast, unstoppable, and deeply unsettling. Nobody raised their voice, nobody panicked. but I could feel the dread in the room, a shared understanding that this wasn't a one-off act of violence. Someone had been able to slip in and out of those canyons with a young man at their mercy, and no one knew how far that shadow reached. When Michael and Diane Ward arrived 2 days later, I met them in the lot. The air smelled of dust and hot metal, and the wind tugged gently at Diane's sleeve as she stepped out of the truck. She looked smaller than I remembered from her voice on the phone, as if the desert had taken something from her before she even got here. Michael kept one arm around her. His jaw-clenched eyes rimmed red. They didn't ask many questions at first. They just waited, holding each other while the sheriff walked them through what we knew. When Diane's knees buckled, Michael caught her before she hit the ground, their grief folding into the silence in a way that made my chest ache. I stepped back to give them space, but the sound of her crying, soft broken, carrying through the stillness, will stay with me for as long as I live. Word spread through the towns faster than official statements could catch it. Gas stations, diners, campgrounds, everyone seemed to whisper about the message on the cave wall. Folks came by the station with casseroles and bottled water, small attempts at comfort in a place where comfort rarely sticks. Some cried openly. Others just nodded with a solemn heaviness. The desert communities out here can feel wide apart, but when tragedy hits, they pull tight. You could sense it in the way strangers placed a hand on each other's shoulders and lingered a second longer than usual. Justice, when it began to take shape, didn't come with the satisfying speed anyone wanted. It came slowly, methodically, like a long breath pulled in before speaking a painful truth. Investigators traced the gray-bearded man in the red jacket through camera footage, witness statements, and the kind of small, overlooked clues that only reveal themselves when a case finally snaps into focus. His name, Lucas Easton, surfaced in the data like something rising from deep water. A drifter, a history of violence, a pattern that placed him near trails where other people had vanished. The arrest, when it finally happened months later, took place hundreds of miles from our canyon, a sting operation in a crowded parking lot. Officers said he went quietly, almost peacefully, as if he'd known the end was coming and simply chose not to fight it. In his vehicle were pieces of equipment that traced back to several missing hikers, unmistakable proof that Ethan hadn't been his only victim. The diary and the stash found at his hidden property sealed the truth no one wanted to say aloud. The desert hadn't just concealed Ethan. It had hidden the work of a man who treated human life like something he could pick up and discard when it suited him. When the trial came, I attended the hearings I could manage, sitting near the back of the courtroom, the air always a little too cold from overworked vents. Lucas sat there with an expression that never changed, blank, detached eyes forward, but not truly seeing. Ethan's parents sat together in the front row, their hands intertwined, knuckles pale. The evidence was overwhelming. The carved message, the recovered belongings, the entries in Lucas's diary that described following hikers like a hunter shadowing prey. The jury didn't take long. Life without parole. It was the closest thing to justice the world could offer, but justice isn't a balm. It doesn't warm the empty chair at a family table. After the sentencing, life in the canyonlands returned to what passes for normal. But the normal felt different. The air seemed to carry an awareness it didn't have before, as if the land itself remembered what had happened. I noticed it most on early mornings at the station, when the sun painted the eastern cliffs and the world was quiet except for the soft flutter of a raven's wings overhead. Young hikers still came through asking about routes and water tables, but I found myself studying their faces more closely, listening for an uncertainty they might not admit. I spoke a little longer, made sure they heard the warning behind the friendly advice. A few extra minutes could save a life. That truth stayed pressed into me like a ridgeline under the skin. Ben and I worked side by side through the fall, trying to settle back into our rhythm. But sometimes I'd catch him staring out across the mesas with a far-off look, thumb brushing the brim of his hat, the way he did when something weighed on him. We didn't talk about the cave often. Maybe once or twice when the evenings grew too still and the memories crept back. Mostly, though, we carried it quietly, like men who've seen a shadow they can't unsee. Ethan's parents created a small scholarship in his name at a community program back in Albuquerque. I attended the first ceremony on a warm spring day, cicadas buzzing in the trees overhead. They welcomed a group of young folks hoping to study outdoor sciences and safety, and for a moment, I felt something like hope settle across the gathering. Diane hugged me afterward, her cheek warm against mine, her breath unsteady. Michael shook my hand with a grip that lingered, and I could feel how much he carried behind his eyes. Grief changes shape over time, but it never disappears. It just threads itself into the routines of life. For me, the canyon changed in subtle ways. Places I once saw as beautiful now held echoes of that search dust swirling in the air, the hush inside the shaft, the carved letters catching the pale glow of my flashlight. I still patrol those trails, still greet hikers as they sign in, still watch the sun rise over stone that looks ancient and unmoved. But each time I see an empty parking space where someone should have returned, I feel that thin thread of worry pull taut inside me sharper than before. Sometimes when I lie awake at night listening to the low hum of the swamp cooler and the distant rustle of wind across the desert, I think about those burned matches scattered across the floor of that cave. I think about how much strength it must have taken for Ethan to carve those words, knowing the darkness was closing in. That image sits with me, the final spark of a young man fighting to leave the truth behind, lighting brief slivers of light in a place that wanted to swallow him whole. I carry that memory carefully, not as a burden, but as a reminder of the responsibility we owe to every person who steps into these canyons believing they're alone with the land. They're not. None of us ever truly are. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.